When the television series Biography, which airs on the Arts and Entertainment Channel, addressed the question of the most important figure of the past millennium, from the year 1000 to the year 2000, they placed Johann Gutenberg first, Isaac Newton second, and Martin Luther third. In the 1997 Millennium issue of Life magazine, Martin Luther was also named third, behind Thomas Edison and Christopher Columbus. When members of the Religion News Writers Association, and these are reporters and editors who write for the secularized media, when they were asked to vote for the most significant religious story in the past 1,000 years, the event that came out on top was Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to a Wittenberg church door in 1517, which, they said, quote, sparked a Protestant Reformation whose results are still being felt, end of quote. Now, if it were up to me, I would have put Martin Luther first, ahead of Gutenberg and ahead of Newton, Edison, and Columbus. That's because without the Reformation, Newton probably would have accomplished very little, because he would most likely have been stuck in a flawed Aristotelian view of the material world, and Gutenberg's press would have gathered a lot of dust for a long time, because it took off printing Bibles and a ton of bulletins written by Luther. And yes, it's true, Edison made a lot of great inventions, for which I'm very thankful, but the Reformation even paved a way for Edison to do what he did, whether he realized it or not. And as for Columbus, he discovered something he wasn't actually looking for, and many believe he wasn't the first European to do so. Well, you can argue with me on these points, but I think most historians agree that Luther changed the course of history in dramatic ways that are still being felt today. Most people know of Luther's Herculean efforts to reform the church of the 1500s. But, as Vishal Mangalwadi points out in his book, The Book That Made Your World, Luther also called for a complete overhaul of medieval education. In an open letter to the Christian nobility, Luther said, "I believe there is no work more worthy of pope or emperor than a thorough reform of the universities. And on the other hand, nothing could be more devilish or disastrous than unreformed universities." Mangalwadi also notes that Luther called the church-owned and operated Renaissance universities places for the training of youth in the fashions of Greek culture, where little is taught of the Holy Scriptures and Christian faith, and where only the blind heathen teacher Aristotle rules far more than Christ. Luther maintained that Aristotle's books, Physics, Metaphysics, Concerning the Soul, and Ethics, which hitherto have been thought to be his best books, should be completely discarded, along with all the rest of his books that boast about nature, although nothing can be learned from them, either about nature or the spirit. Well, Luther, who knew and taught Aristotle himself, would only keep Aristotle's books Logic, Rhetoric, and Poetics, and those without commentaries. Luther wanted the Bible to be the center of the curriculum. But Luther had his hands full reforming the church. The Reformation of education fell upon one coming after Luther, born in 1592 in Moravia, which is now the Czech Republic. The effects of the Reformation on the development of education in the West and other parts of the world that were affected by the offspring of the Reformation, like Charles Grant and William Carey in India, really can't be overstated. You see, the ball that Martin Luther got rolling in 1517 was something like that gigantic rolling rock that rumbled and tumbled with increasing momentum towards Indiana Jones in the jungle cave. Luther worked tirelessly, at the risk of being burned at the stake, by the way, to open the eyes of people to basic truths of the Bible, which he felt were as comprehensible to cobblers as they were to kings, if they could only read it for themselves in their common language. Among other things, Luther translated the Bible into the common German language for the people to read. And this, combined with Gutenberg's press that made the Bible accessible, changed everything. And it provided a compelling reason for literacy among all. And it was driven by the revolutionary idea that truth would set people free if they could only read it for themselves. Now think about this. Common people, if literate, could read truth for themselves. This was a very big deal. And their children could read truth too if they were literate. Now the people of the Reformation didn't just view the Bible as a collection of interesting bedtime stories. They perceived the Bible as the very Word of God. And reformers like Calvin saw it as the foundation for building cities like Geneva, where he put theology into practice and transformed what was once called the smelliest city in Europe to a city on a hill that really inspired an entire continent. And hopefully by now you've read Tom Bloomer's recounting of that story in the article you're required to read for this course called Calvin and Geneva, Nation Building Missions. If you haven't read that yet, please do so. Now, as I mentioned, Luther saw the great necessity for educational reform by replacing the school's fixation on Aristotle with a love for the Bible. And as I said, Luther had his hands full reforming the church, so it fell on John Comenius to reform education. He was born in 1592. He was one of the prime movers behind an educational movement of the 1600s that Dr. David Scott calls integrationism. Now, Comenius was a bishop in the Moravian Brethren. He wrote about 90 books on education, and many people consider Comenius to be the father of contemporary education. He's really a giant among reformers. Comenius is to contemporary schools, including American schools, what Martin Luther was to the church. And like Luther, Comenius experienced his share of suffering. His innovative school in Bohemia was burned along with his books, and his house was also burned, and his property was taken. And some of the books he wrote on the topic of education were actually written while he was in hiding in cold and dangerous woods. And although Comenius was born in today's Czech Republic, he did a lot of his work there, but he also worked in Holland and Sweden and Poland and Hungary. And in addition, he responded to a request from the English Parliament to come to that country to reform their system of public education. And he also helped start the first modern university at Halle, Germany. And that university later merged with Luther's university to form the Wittenberg-Halle University. Now, Comenius was an innovator and a pioneer in educational practice that's taken for granted today. For example, Comenius wrote one of the first reading books that incorporated illustrations. It was a textbook called The World in Pictures, and this textbook was actually printed in the United States up until 1887. Now, it's not very many textbooks you'll find that are used for over 200 years. He also advocated principles of mastery learning, like bringing students from simple concepts to more increasingly complex concepts, building upon each other in an incremental way. He advocated a graded system of schools, much like we follow today, and he also incorporated drama productions in order to make learning enjoyable. Now, today the Comenius Medal is awarded by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, for outstanding achievement in educational research and innovation. Now, if I had the task of naming a new Christian school, I think the name Comenius Academy would probably be among the top contenders. Now, here's an interesting relief that appears on a school in the Czech Republic. And no, that's not Jesus on the left. That's John Comenius in an educator's robe. Now, several things strike me about this piece of art. Let's take a closer look. First of all, note the book that Comenius is holding in his right arm. The large book with the faint cross on the cover. This is not a dictionary. This is, no doubt, a Bible. Well, like Luther, Calvin, and Knox, who went before him, Comenius saw the Bible as essential for engaging rightly with all things. And he saw the Bible as holding the key to a truly holistic worldview that took into consideration the lordship of Christ and the rule of God in all affairs of men. And for him, just like with Luther, Calvin, and John Knox, there really was no sacred secular split. There was no division or compartmentalization of things into things of God and things of men. He saw creation, humanity, and God all in one integrated picture. Well, needless to say, René Descartes, who was one of Comenius's contemporaries, he was born just 4 years after Comenius, Descartes was not happy with Comenius's integrated view of all things. Comenius was combining all knowledge, including science, with theology, while Descartes, as we discussed earlier, he sought to separate science from theology. Well, in the end, Descartes won out. But then again, history isn't over, is it? We'll have to see what happens in the next century. Along the bottom of this relief is a sentence in the Czech language that says, "You will once again rule over your own things, Czech people." Now, this rulership that Comenius was speaking of here was most certainly not human-centered, do-your-own-thing kind of rulership. Comenius saw the rule of God as key to the happiness of humanity, self-government under God, an incredible concept that came out of the Reformation. It was applied not only to those who lived in castles on a hill, but for the common folk as well. Comenius saw the rule of God as applicable to the here and now, and not just the by and by. This was his motivation for education itself. Comenius was the first educational leader on earth to champion universal schooling. Male, female, rich, poor, gifted, or mentally challenged. He saw education as something for all. Now, Vishal Mangalwadi maintains that William Wilberforce and William Carey and other really significant 18th and 19th century culture makers were following Comenius, even if some of them were not conscious of it. Not only modern India, but also modern America was shaped by Comenius's vision. The difference is that the pioneers of American education knew the debt they owed to Comenius. They invited him to come to the New World to head up their new college, Harvard, in New England. Comenius's optimism through education had a profound impact on some Puritan settlers in America, so that they chose to become an educational community before becoming a commercial or industrial nation. Now, here's the great link to the Puritan founders of Harvard, and Yale and to Noah Webster and to most American schools through the 18th century. The role of Comenius in providing a foundation for Noah Webster's views on education in America really can't be overstated. Comenius was the prime mover in the educational movement that provided the academic foundation for Harvard and Yale for the first 150 years at least. Now, as far as American public schools go, the last lingering embers of the Pansophic movement that Comenius began were extinguished in 1962 when the Supreme Court outlawed even a little reading of the Bible as part of the regular school day for American students. And this used to be as common in American schools as saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Well, Comenius called the medieval schools of his day slaughterhouses of the mind. His mission was to make schools an imitation of heaven. How? By making intentional connections between all subjects taught in school and the larger frame of reference that a biblical worldview provides. In other words, through biblical worldview integration with all academics. Now, as I mentioned, Comenius called his educational philosophy Pansophia. Now, that's an interesting word. Sophia is the Greek term for light, not in the sense of light from a candle, but in the sense of the light of understanding or wisdom. And pan is a Greek term for the union of parts into a group. So Pansophia was an integration or coming together of all wisdom, no matter where it might be found, into a unified framework. And this, in essence, is what the integrationists wanted from education. This is what drove the so-called integrationism movement of the 1600s. All academic subjects, no matter what they entailed, were made complete or whole as they were put into the context of the larger frame of reference that a biblical worldview provides. Now, this is integration at its best, even today. The course that you are now taking is based on the premise that all Christian teachers, no matter what grades they teach or what subject matter they deal with, should be and can be very skilled integrationists. It's not rocket science, and it's nothing new. More importantly, we can teach our students to be skilled integrationists as well, and really that's the goal. Now, when it comes to making Christian education truly Christian, it really requires more than opening the day with prayer or having chapel once a week or employing Christians who are committed followers of Christ. Now, these are all necessary things in Christian education, but if there's no biblical worldview integration taking place in the context of academic instruction, we're really falling short of what Christian education can and should be. What I want to talk about in this session has to do with things like making connections in the math class between math skills that students are learning and the larger frame of reference that surrounds math, that brings meaning to math, beyond math itself. And what I'm talking about here is helping students see how math fits into the rest of the story, to see how it fits into God's purpose for the material world, and how math fits into our calling to govern over the material world, and how math fits into our role as rulers over numbers. Do our students actually see math as a tool for fulfilling the first commission of Genesis 1:26 to 28? Do they use it as such? Do they see themselves as engaging in what that commission requires? Whenever they solve a math problem, no matter how simple or complex that problem might be. And when our students solve math problems, do they actually see themselves exercising a God-given capacity for reason? Are they cognizant of this? Do they see themselves as reflectors of the glory of God when they successfully work out a math problem? Do they recognize that they're doing something no animal has the capacity to do? And can they celebrate this once in a while? When our students see how certain calculations work, do they realize that they are actually getting a glimpse into the mind of God, the creator of math? Are they consciously making those kinds of mental connections? And do our teachers and our students in Christian schools see math as an expression of discipleship? Are we, as teachers, able to use math as an opportunity for building patience and persistence in our students' lives? Do we see it as a catalyst for the fruit of the Spirit to be developed? Can we be this intentional about making connections between math and the bigger picture of a biblical worldview? This is integration. Think about this. Ephesians 2:10 tells us that we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Well, how do math skills connect with those good works which we were created to do? Do math skills connect with those good works? How many of you have ever had a math teacher give you the assignment after you've learned a particular math skill to go out over the weekend and use that skill to accomplish a specific good work at home or in the community, and then come back on Monday and give the class a little report on what good work you did and how your math skill allowed you to do that work well? Well, this too is what integration is all about. Could such a good work, for example, include building a doghouse for a pet? What would William Wilberforce say about that? I think he would agree that building a good doghouse is a good work. Well, that's one reason God created people in the first place, so that we could rule well over wood and animals, making excellent doghouses, among other things. Well, try building a decent doghouse with no math skills. And if you have a student who actually uses math well to build a good doghouse, can his or her work be celebrated in the context of the math class? Can the bigger story that we know from Genesis 1 be combined with Ephesians 2:10 to bring extraordinary meaning to math and to everything else, every other subject, every other endeavor? Well, this is holistic Christian education. This is what it means to think integratively about math and about pets and about purpose. This is what it means to think Christianly, if you will, about life, and to think integratively about the whole of God's world and our role in it. There's also a moral order component that goes along with math skills. Math can be used for good or evil. Any math skill can be used to further goodness and truth and beauty in the world. The same skill can be used to promote evil, lies, and hideousness. Well, what determines one or the other is the human being who puts that math skill to work, either in alignment with Christ or in opposition to him. Can students and teachers talk about this once in a while in the context of a math class? Well, thankfully, we can talk about it in a Christian school. And if we are not thinking and talking about it just as openly and plainly as I am right now, our Christian schools will go the way of Harvard. Sorry to say. Well, similar questions about how any academic subject relates to the rest of the story or the bigger picture of a biblical worldview can be asked about science and language arts and literature, history, PE, music, and art. Integration, as I'm using the term here, helps students to see how all academic subjects connect with the whole of God's story, the whole of God's world, and in doing so, a grand sense of greater meaning can be brought to the study of math and science, and the writing of short stories, and the learning of language. Now, when Vishal Manguwadi describes John Comenius's philosophy of Pan-Sophia as integrating all wisdom, secular and sacred, into a biblical framework, I can't help but think that the sort of connections I've been making here with math are the sort of connections Comenius and those others that were involved in this movement had in mind. I think you can see that when we speak of biblical worldview integration, I'm not talking about adding a Bible verse to the end of a lesson, or opening with prayer, or calling art Christian because it includes an angel or a church or a dove somewhere on the canvas. And I'm not talking about turning a lesson about wheat harvesting into an object lesson about the end of the age. While this may have its place in another context, this is not what I mean by integration. This is sermonizing. And this approach to integration really misses the mark completely. The question then is, how do we put academics into the context of a biblical big picture and do it in such a way that we aren't turning academic lessons into object lessons or sermonettes? Is there some kind of template that we can use to make fitting and relevant connections between academic subjects and the bigger picture of a biblical worldview? Well, that's where the tool I'm sharing with you in this session comes in. I call it the Integration Conversation Starter. Well, during the 14 years that I was a principal in a Christian school, I hired a fair number of teachers, and I can count on less than one hand the number of teachers I hired who had received formal training in biblically integrative lesson plan design prior to coming to my school. In fact, there were not many teachers that came to my school from any sort of university that had any training at all in basic biblical worldview. So most Christian school administrators really have to start at a fundamental level in training their teachers how to integrate academics with a biblical worldview. I want to share with you a simple tool that will go a long way toward giving you the confidence you need to integrate the biblical worldview with subject matter in the classroom. And this tool is just as useful for pastors and youth pastors and parents as it is for classroom teachers. Well, bear in mind that one of the requirements for this course is that you teach a lesson to students or to your peers or to your students' parents in which you make relevant connections between any subject of your choice and the bigger picture of a biblical worldview using this tool I'm going to teach you called the Integration conversation starter. Now, after you've taught this, I want you to submit a copy of your lesson plan along with the conversation starter that you used in your lesson and a 1 or 2 page simple report on how it went. Just tell me the highlights of how it was received and some of the outcomes. But first I need to explain how the integration conversation starter works. Well, to understand how the integration conversation starter works, I'd like you to remember the basic principle that we all interpret smaller things in light of larger wholes. It's the principle I shared in the very first lecture. Remember this? Your concept of the bigger picture, of the larger whole, so to speak, could cause you to interpret this small piece as a foothill in the distance behind a farm. Or it could cause you to interpret this as a banana. Well, there's only one big picture that's the real authentic frame of reference for this small piece. There's only one big picture I took that small piece from originally. Only one big picture that will allow you to interpret that piece for what it really is. Any other frame of reference will lead you to a misinterpretation of what that smaller piece actually is. A banana. Well, again, the point is simply that the larger frame of reference provides a basis for bringing proper meaning to the smaller piece. And in the same way, the larger frame of reference that a biblical worldview provides allows teachers to bring authentic meaning to the smaller pieces of any academic subject that's dealt with at school. Now, this template is located in the course content area of the online platform that you're using for this course in the Session 6 folder. I'd like you to put this presentation on pause now and go to this folder and print out several copies of the Integration Conversation Starter. Now, the first step is to identify the particular piece of subject or the subject matter that you want to focus on and write that in the center of the page in the small box. And then consider how the biblical view of God, creation, humanity, moral order, and purpose casts light on that particular subject or brings meaning to that subject as it's viewed within the context of the biblical big picture. Now, this will make more sense as I walk you through an example of how the integration conversation starter might be used in a high school biology class. Now, to do this, I'd like to take you back to session 1 when I showed you a short video clip of a group of animists sitting in a circle deep in the forest of North Carolina. Remember, they were lamenting the cutting of trees, and they were celebrating the life in rocks. I asked you to consider what assumptions or beliefs were behind the statements you heard from the group and behind their behavior. I asked you to consider how their view of God, their view of creation, their view of humanity, moral order, and purpose might have affected their behavior. And I also asked you to consider what beliefs were in harmony with the biblical worldview, as well as what beliefs were in conflict with it. Well, the integration conversation starter is a tool that'll make that whole process much easier. Now, it's been a while since you viewed the video clip of the American animists in the forest, so I want to show it to you again for the sake of this exercise. The clip is short.
I want to mourn the loss of all the old growth trees I've seen and tell them that we love them and that we
to this cathedral. Bring me to this rock that has the most incredible life.
I've looked at clear cuts and burnt forest, and I've felt outraged, but I didn't scream and I didn't cry. And I need to.
Now, I'd like you to start by writing down your thoughts about how the apparent concept of God that these animists might have would cause them to interpret trees and rocks in the way they did. What specifically do you think about their concept of God might have caused them to say what they said or do what they did? Now, put this presentation on pause for a moment and take time to jot down your thoughts in the area of the conversation starter pertaining to God. Now move over to the creation area of the conversation starter and put this presentation on pause again and jot down what you think their concept of creation might be and how this might influence their interaction with trees or rocks. What might be their belief about creation based on what little you have heard from them and seen from them? Now I'll go to the humanity area of the conversation starter. And what does it appear that their concept of humanity might be? How might this concept have influenced their interaction with trees? And again, put this presentation on pause while you jot down your thoughts in the humanity area of the conversation starter. And while you've got it on pause, go ahead and do the same for moral, order, and purpose. But as you do this, I don't want you to just focus on the elements you observe that are in conflict with the biblical worldview. Also, consider any elements that may be in harmony, if there are any. Now, if you're using the integration conversation starter in a high school biology class, you might start by asking the class, after they view this clip, what do you think their concept of God might be? And how do you think this concept might be influencing the way they interact with trees and rocks? Likewise, after you've talked about that for a while, you can go around the clock, so to speak, and talk about the other key areas. Now, you don't have to take it in that particular order. You can jump around a bit. But in each part of the conversation, I would be sure to ask if the students saw or heard anything that was in harmony with the biblical worldview before I asked if they saw and heard anything that was in conflict. Well, I want to give you another example, a different way to use the integration conversation starter, and this way can be used in lower grades. Let's say you're teaching a unit on plants in the 6th grade, and your goal is to not help them to understand how different worldviews see plants and affects the way they interact with them, but you want them to see plants in the context of a biblical worldview. And let's say you're doing a 2-week study on plants, and you could start by using the integration conversation starter as part of your introductory lesson to the whole unit. it will set the tone for all that's to follow. In fact, I really recommend using the conversation starter exercise at the beginning of a unit of study. The integration conversation starter provides some thought-out starting points for conversations about plants and the biblical worldview in a rational and a balanced way. And now by rational and balanced, I mean conversations about plants that relate plants to all 5 biblical worldview components. Now, to help you in this process, I recommend you use the Questions for Biblical Worldview Contextualization. Now, this document is located in the Session 6 course content area of your online learning platform. Now, if you haven't printed out a copy of this document yet, please put this presentation on pause and print out a copy now. Now, these questions help teachers and students to think through how any academic subject relates to the larger context of truth and reality that the biblical worldview provides. Now, not every question on this list fits well with every academic topic, of course. Now, if a particular question doesn't fit the topic at hand, just skip it. You may have to adjust the wording slightly to fit whatever subject you're focusing on. Now, the questions are conveniently arranged according to the 5 worldview components of God, creation, humanity, moral order, and purpose. And when you read through this list, you'll immediately see the helpfulness of this resource. Many of these questions are at higher thinking levels that are most appropriate for students in upper grades, but with a little thought, you can adjust the wording to fit the vocabulary of younger students. Now, this resource will give you and your students plenty to talk about, and it will provide many ways to spark conversations in class that can get students really thinking holistically. I encourage you to use these same questions in staff meetings to practice thinking holistically about a wide variety of subjects that you and your peers are dealing with as adults. And this would be a fun way to test out a lot of these questions with your coworkers before you use them with your students. Now, to tie these questions in with the integration starter, just put one question in each of the 5 areas, and you'll have plenty of connecting points for integrative conversations that relate either to your unit of study or to your individual lessons. You just have to be careful that you don't use too many of these questions at one time. Often, one question is enough to prompt a really good discussion. But the questions provide a pool of possibilities for you as a teacher to generate meaningful classroom conversations that are integrative and what I would call holistic. Now, the idea is not to use every question that's listed here, but to draw from the list and to be selective in coming up with questions that really fit your purposes and what you think might provide a truly meaningful or holistic classroom conversation relating to whatever subject matter you're teaching. Asking questions is really one of the most powerful ways to engage students in the process of thinking holistically about any particular theme or subject. And it's always better when the students make the connections themselves, rather than just having a teacher inform them of those connections. But then again, a lot depends on the grade level of the students. Informing students of the connections in the youngest ages is really quite appropriate, while asking questions is increasingly effective as the students develop their higher level thinking skills, such as analysis and synthesis and evaluation. Under the God section, the first question says, how do you think God looks at blank? Well, here you would fill in the blank with the word plants. Another question might be, how do you think God feels about plants? Or why do you think plants are really important to God? Are they important to God? If so, why? Now, again, you have to be selective about what particular questions you want to focus your classroom conversation around. You might want to use one particular discussion question for your unit introduction and save other questions for later specific lessons where they might be especially appropriate. Now, the purpose of the integration conversation starter template is so that you can be intentional about your planning. And you should also be prepared for students to bring their own thoughts to the conversation. This is really the beauty of an open classroom conversation. It really allows the students to share their ideas, and that's normal. And as with any normal conversation, one thought-provoking question can get the ball rolling. But where the conversation goes from there will be up to others involved in the conversation. And letting the students take the integration conversation in a direction you hadn't planned can be a good thing. The conversation may turn out better than you had planned. Allowing the students to explore the worldview connections with plants in a free-flowing manner that interests them can be a good thing if it's done well. Now, another thing you can do is to share these tools with your students and have them do the prep work for a classroom conversation. Give them a copy of the questions for biblical worldview contextualization, and give them a copy of the template and explain how it works, just like I've explained to you, and set them loose at this themselves. Now, in a classroom situation with sixth graders, for example, you might have the students fill out the conversation starter as an assignment, a homework assignment, to do at home. Now, let's assume your students have some basic knowledge of biblical worldview, which they've learned in Bible class. But to help them out a bit, you might pass out the 96 Biblical Worldview Truths document. If you don't have a copy of the 96 Biblical Worldview Truths in front of you, please put this presentation on pause and go in the course content area of your online platform and print out a copy of the 96 Biblical Truths. Now, you might start off by asking your students to place a small check mark in the front of any of these 96 biblical truths that particularly relate to plants or to the human relationship with plants. As a matter of fact, I'd like you to do this yourself right now. Please go through the list of 96 biblical premises and put a little check mark right next to any statement that particularly relates to plants or to the human relationship with plants. Put this on pause. Now, after you've marked all of the 96 truth statements that particularly relate to plants or the human relationship with them, think about any biblical truths relating to plants that are not on the list. Put this presentation on pause as you think about that. Well, now that you've given this a lot of thought, I'd like you to transfer your ideas to the integration conversation starter by using one of the blank copies that you printed out. Now, don't write down every connection you thought of, but just write down a few of the connections that are most meaningful to you. Now, go ahead and put this presentation on pause and jot down those connections in the appropriate area of the conversation starter. Now, I'm going to share with you some possible statements from the list of 96 truths that I think relate to plants and the human relationship with them. Now, these may not be the same connections you made, but I expect a lot of them will be the same. I'm doing this just to give you an example of what might be done. First of all, in the God column of the 96 Truths, there's a statement about a third of the way down the page that says, God created all things. Well, this certainly relates to plants. And so does the next statement, that God continuously sustains all things throughout the present. Now, in connection with this, it might be good to draw the student's attention to the fact that any plant that is living today is not just here because God spoke the first plants into existence in the beginning, but they're here today because God is currently at work holding them together by the word of his power, as we're told in Hebrews 1 through 3. And when we touch a plant, we're touching his continuing work. That may be a radical thought to some of you, but think on it. Well, one statement that's not on the list of 96 is the truth that God created plants with the capacity to reproduce after their kind. Now, this capacity allows apple trees to produce apple trees and ferns to produce ferns. Well, that's something to be very thankful for. Now, two other statements about God on the list of 96 that relate to plants are the statements that God transcends his creation and is distinct from it. Well, that reminds us that he's not a plant, and a plant is not God, thankfully. And the next statement, that God is sovereign over all creation, well, that certainly includes plants. He rules over them day and night. Well, a bit further down the list, it says God sees all human acts and discerns all human thoughts and motives. Well, this certainly connects with the human interaction with plants, in that if we are wasteful or abusing our role as governors over plants through some kind of mismanagement, well, God sees that. He weighs it all. Well, this ties in with another statement just down the list a bit, that God is aware and interested in every aspect of each person's life. Now, this certainly includes the lives of people who manage plants, whether they're trees or watermelons. And certainly the next truth statement would have been one that jumped out to George Washington Carver. It says God communicates with humanity. Now, Carver leaned heavily on this connection through his career with plants, trusting that God would actually speak to him in the laboratory as he closed the lab door and asked God to reveal the next secret of the peanut or the soybean, co-creating whatever it was God showed Carver to make. Then down the list a bit more in the God column, it says God reveals himself to humans through his creation. Well, this certainly applies to plants. I'd say so. Could it be part of God's will for someone in a hospital to be cheered up by a beautiful bouquet of flowers? If it is, it means God worked through flower growers somewhere in the world and truck drivers who transported the flowers to market and a retail clerk who expedited the sale. Now, these people may not have known that they were being used of God to accomplish his will, to cheer up a hospital patient, but they were. The integration starter can be used in the context of school and in contexts outside of school. It can be used by a youth director in a church setting, talking about all kinds of issues. It can be used by a pastor for all kinds of sermon topics. It can be used by a parent to help a son or daughter to think through how a movie or a job or an event relates to the bigger picture of reality, real reality. Now back to the classroom for a minute. Obviously, there are many more connections between the biblical worldview and plants that could possibly be discussed in a single classroom conversation. And if you taught a 2-week unit on plants, you could focus on some of these connections all through the unit. The point is to get the students thinking about those connections and talking about them. Well, let's say you don't have time for a lengthy worldview discussion in a particular lesson, but you do want to include something in your lesson on plants that will connect with the bigger picture. Now, often the integrative connection in an academic lesson can be just a single sentence or two. It doesn't need to be a lot of conversation or take a lot of time. Now, I'd like to show you a real classroom example of this sort of integrative touch point. It's a sample of an actual lesson about plants that was taught at the pre-kindergarten level at a school in the Cascade Christian School District. The teacher was Annette Wheeler, and I want to thank Don Johnson for granting me permission to include this video clip here.
Okay, I have a plant here, and we've been watching this plant grow this year. Do you remember when it first came into our classroom? It wasn't very big. It was probably only about that big, wasn't it? But now look at how big it's grown. It almost looks like a tiny baby tree, doesn't it? My question is this. What do you think that this plant needs to grow? Okay, take your hand. I'm going to pick the people whose hands are raised, and I'm going to write your answers down. Kaylee has her hand raised very quietly. Water. Let's write that down. Water. Molly has her hand raised very quietly. Dirt. What else does this plant might need to grow? Courtney. Sunshine. Sunshine. Presley.
Water.
Water, yep, we got water up there. Larissa, what else do you think this plant might need to grow?
Love.
Love, I like that one. Let's write that over here. Okay, let's take two more. Danae?
Sunshine.
Sunshine, yep, we got that one. Scotty?
Tender loving care.
Tender loving care, yep, that's a good one right there. Well, let's see, you can put your hands down now. And I have a story. Let's see if my story will tell us what a plant needs to grow. You guys like it?
Yeah.
I like it. This is my story smock. And I like it because it fits me. And I can tell stories on my story smock. And my story is right here.
The story is in.
It's right here. And I have all these pictures that go with it. Well, one day, a boy planted a seed. He planted a seed, Drew. And look what he put it in. Where did he put it in?
A hole.
He put it in a hole in the
Ground.
Every day, the boy sprinkled the ground with water, and he pulled up the weeds around the seed, and he took care of it. And his big brother said, "It won't come up." But every day, the boy still watered it, and he pulled up the weeds around the seed, and he took care of it. And guess what happened?
It grew.
One day, he came out, and that seed had grown into a beautiful plant. Do you know what he did with that seed? I have one more picture. It's in here. And I'm going to show you because what he did was really nice. It had grown the biggest carrot you ever saw. Now, I have a question for you, because I said that he did something nice, right? Did you know what he did? He shared it with his mom, and he shared it with his dad, and he even shared it with his brother.
It's a big, huge
It
carrot.
was a big, huge carrot. Do you think a
Don't look
carrot
at me
is...
too either.
What does that look like?
A wheelbarrow.
A wheelbarrow. In that seed, where's the picture of the seed? In that seed, God gave all the information that seed would need to grow. But you know what else God needs? God needs us to help take care of that seed. He needs us to help make sure that we put it in the dirt, Tristan. And He needs us to help make sure that we give it water and that we put it in the sunshine. And guess what? Even kids can help. Did you know that you have a job to do? Even kids get to help take care of God's creation. Well, you know what we have for you? Remember yesterday we painted pots?
Still got something on there.
That's okay. Yesterday we made pots. Well, you guys each get to plant a seed of your own. You have your own little seed packet here. And your job is going to be to give this plant, what does it need? Water and sunshine and what else? Dirt. You have dirt in here. And what happens if weeds start growing in there? We need to take the weeds out so it doesn't break the flower.
Now here we saw an example of biblical worldview integration that just took a moment or two in the context of a fuller lesson. This very brief occurrence of integration really helped the students to view the academic subject matter, in this case the growth needs of plants, to view that in connection with the bigger picture of God's first commission to govern over plants. Now Mrs. Wheeler was not giving any kind of an object lesson here. She wasn't sermonizing. She was actually making a very natural and normal connection between the growth needs of plants and the human responsibility to govern over them. It was a connection that fit, and it fit well and very naturally. Now, it's important to point out, however, that Mrs. Wheeler had a specific connection in mind before she started teaching this particular lesson. She wasn't flying by the seat of her pants with respect to biblical worldview integration. She actually built this into her academic lesson plan. She determined ahead of time what specific connection she wanted to make, and she knew where and when in the lesson she wanted to make that connection. So the connection was a natural way to link the story of the carrot seed with the growth needs of plants and the bigger picture of what that's all about from a Christian perspective. And she is actually thinking Christianly, and in doing that, she's helping her students to think Christianly about plants. She's shaping this kid's view of plants. She's enabling them to think theologically about the growth needs of carrots. That's what holistic Christian education does. But as teachers, are we pulling back the veil, so to speak, in an intentional manner to enable our students to clearly see and talk about the revelation of God or the heart of God or the character of God expressed through plants? That's the big question. Where will this kind of activity happen if it doesn't happen in the Christian school? Well, as you can see, we're thinking theologically about plants here. The fact is, we can think theologically about everything, and we can teach our students to think theologically about everything also. We can and we must do this. The Biblical Worldview Institute, which is a division of Cascade Christian Schools near Seattle, really does provide excellent resources for help in this area. And I want to recommend one particular publication they put out called the Biblical Worldview Integration Guide. Every Christian educator should have a copy of this on his or her desk. I'm quite serious about this. This provides page after page of ideas for making connections between academic subjects and the bigger picture that can help any teacher to really be proficient in teaching holistically. This book is a gold mine. Well, this concludes session 6, and in the next session I'll be addressing the question, have you ever seen a secular color? I'll see you then.